Over the last 10 weeks during lockdown, we've been looking at a series on faith in lockdown in John's Gospel. And today I want to talk to you from the last chapter of John's Gospel, John chapter 21, about faith and the future. How do we come out of lockdown? I don't know how you're feeling about the end of lockdown. For some, you're probably thinking, I can't wait. I can't wait to see people again. I can't wait to get back to work, back to normal. Some of you may be feeling slightly less excited about this. Maybe there are fears, understandable fears about your health or about the future. I went for my first haircut since lockdown this week, and I was really excited about it. I mean, no offense to Jill, who's done a valiant effort over lockdown and trying to keep my barnet in order, but I was super excited. But when I got there, the barber had his mask on his chin and was happily sort of coming up to people fairly close and sort of chatting to them. So I was slightly worried about that. But maybe that sums up the mixture of feelings that we have about going out of lockdown. What I want to look at today is a passage in the end of John's Gospel, John chapter 21, where Jesus appears to his disciples. And it's an interesting time because John 20, the chapter before, Jesus is resurrected. He appears to Mary Magdalene, first of all. Then he appears to the disciples as they are in an upper room in lockdown. And then he appears to Thomas on his own. And that's the end of chapter 20. He commissions them, sends them off. And then in chapter 21, we find them back in Galilee, their home. They haven't been there for a while. They've been in Jerusalem and they're by Lake Galilee, and Peter is there and he decides to go fishing. And you might be thinking, well, this is really strange. Jesus commissioned them to go change the world for him. And what have they done? They've gone back to normal. They've gone back to what they know. And I wonder whether God is saying to us in this time, don't go back to normal. Move forward with me. What does that look like? Well, let's read this passage in John 21. And the disciples have gone fishing, but they can't catch anything. There's a bit of a pattern here. At the beginning of Luke's gospel, that the disciples are fishing. They can't catch anything. And in John 21, Jesus appears on the shore of Lake Galilee, and they don't recognize him. And he says to them, put your nets down the other side and you'll catch a load of fish. And so they do so, and they catch a huge number of fish. And immediately Peter says, it's the Lord, it's Jesus. And he jumps into the water and swims as fast as he can to meet Jesus. The others follow in the boat, towing all these fish. And Jesus there with a barbecue. He's got some fish going. He's got breakfast cooking for them. And then he calls Peter aside and has a conversation with him. And we pick up the conversation in verse 15. Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Don't go backwards, move forwards. What is it that tempts us to go back to what we know? Well, it's a very normal human reaction. We've experienced a huge amount of change. The disciples have experienced a huge amount of change. In many ways, it's very normal for them to have gone back to what they knew, to fishing in Galilee. And I think there are three things, maybe, reasons why they've gone back. We don't know, but here's three things that might reflect a little bit about our feelings about the future. The first is fear about the future. Why have they gone back to fishing? Well, they're probably thinking, well, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. You know, we've spent 3 years with this guy, Jesus, in Jerusalem, and he's resurrected, but we've only seen him once or twice. And what's going to happen? Where is he? Well, we don't know about the future. We're worried. And that may be how you're feeling about the end of lockdown. I certainly have felt fears about that. Maybe it's about the health situation with COVID, but maybe it's also about your work situation. What kind of job are you going to have? Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you're on furlough. It's very uncertain. Maybe social situations that are quite awkward and difficult. We were actually at a wedding, a wonderful wedding on Saturday, but there was a certain amount of nervousness about how to engage with those social situations. All sorts of fears that you might have about the future. But secondly, I think there might have been worries about failures in the past. Certainly for Peter, that was the case. You know, one reason for not going on to what he had been called to, Jesus had said, you're going to be the rock on which I build my church. And yet he found himself back fishing. Is it because he had experienced such abject failure by denying Jesus 3 times? It's quite hard to get our heads around quite what a mistake Peter had made. You know, Jesus had 12 disciples. He was one of the 12. But within those, he had 3 disciples he spent most of his time with, Peter, James, and John. Peter was arguably the closest human being to Jesus. And not only that, he'd boasted about how dedicated he was to Jesus. He'd said to Jesus on one occasion, all these guys might leave you, but I will never leave you. I will go even to death to follow you. He had been so brash about his dedication to Jesus, and yet it was spectacular the way he denied him. As Jesus was being tried and then crucified, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And the last time it says he called down curses. Many commentators think called down curses on Jesus. And actually, if anyone was any doubt, is this guy a follower of Jesus? This would have shown people outright that Peter had nothing to do with him. And then the cock crows 3 times. Can you imagine how Peter felt carrying the weight of this guilt, this regret about the past? I don't know whether regrets about the past dog you, but again, it's a very normal experience. Things that you've done in your life that you regret, that you've done wrong. And actually the Bible calls this sin. It's not a very popular word, but it's where we put ourselves before others, before God in our decisions. And you know, maybe during lockdown you have things that you regret, things that you wish you'd done differently. You know, all the research says that relationships in lockdown have been really difficult. There's been many breakups of relationships. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. We carry with us much of that pain and regret. Maybe career decisions that you've made in the past or things that have happened. Maybe even things that no one else knows about. I was reading the incidents of people consuming adult content has risen almost 300% during lockdown. These things we can carry with us, and they can hold us back. In fact, they do hold us back because they stop us from living with absolute confidence the way that we feel God has called us to live. So, fears about the future, failures in the past, but maybe equally frustrations with the present. You might be thinking, well, I'm not particularly fearful about the future. I'm not particularly carrying any deep failures with me, but I'm just frustrated in the present. The normality of life is so dull I wonder whether the disciples felt like that as well. They had gone back to what they'd known. Jesus had said, in fairness to them, go to Galilee and I will meet you there. They've gone back to what they know. They're probably just going through the motions. Maybe you feel like that at the moment. They're probably thinking, well, where is God in the midst of this mundanity, of this repetitive work that we're doing? And yet in the midst of that, Jesus meets them. And in fact, Jesus addresses all three of these things: frustrations with the present, fears about the future, failures in the past. And maybe the way that Jesus responds can help us as we come out of lockdown. Firstly, Jesus is with you in the present. In the midst of whatever your life is looking like at the moment, Jesus is there with you. And we see that in this passage. The disciples doing this fruitless work. They've got nothing. They've caught nothing. And then Jesus appears and everything changes. They go from no fish to 153. They actually counted the number of fish. And the difference is Jesus, the presence of Jesus. And you can see how John is linking this in this gospel to what Jesus said about remaining in him. You know, what matters is not your productivity, but the presence of Jesus. Focus on the presence of Jesus and not on your productivity. And actually what's interesting is that Peter sees the miraculous fish and his reaction is not about the fish, but about the person. He jumps in the water. He can't wait to see Jesus, despite his flaws and his failures. It's the presence of Jesus that he seeks. I mentioned going to this wedding on Saturday. I was taking the wedding of Amy, who's a great friend, works with us on the team. And her and Dave have been amazing during lockdown. They've had so many disappointments about planning their wedding, so many frustrations. And I think at times they'd probably say, where is God in the midst of this frustration? But you know what was amazing on Saturday when they had their wedding and they saw each other in the church and their eyes met. You know, none of that mattered anymore. The logistics, the number of people, the plans, all that stuff went out the window when they saw each other, when Amy saw her bridegroom. And actually, Jesus is with us. He's the bridegroom. The church is the bride. We get to be with Jesus. So Jesus is with you in this present moment. But secondly, Jesus can deal with your past, with your regrets, with the things that you wish you'd done differently, with your sin. And Jesus shows this by taking Peter right back to the place where he let Jesus down. He's built a fire. The fire was where Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He then takes him off and asks him, do you love me more than these? In other words, you said that you'd love me more than these. Do you love me more than these? That would have gone right to the heart of Peter. Can you imagine how he would have felt? And then he asks him 3 times. 3 times, do you love me? You know, the 3rd time, Peter's really hurt. He says, Lord, you know that I love you. And you kind of think, well, Jesus, come on, give this guy a break. You're really twisting the knife. He's not twisting the knife. He's using the knife like a surgeon to get out the sin, the pain, the regret that he has experienced and that he's experiencing. And so I don't know if you've ever seen surgery or had surgery yourself. I've had surgery on my knee. We've actually, one of our lockdown pleasures has been watching ER with a very young George Clooney in it. But every time someone comes into the operating theatre, the trust is in the surgeon to do what is good. They're not doing bad. They're doing what's good. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's not twisting the knife. He's using the knife like a scalpel. And what the patient has to do is to hold still. Obviously, under general anaesthetic, you are still. But when you're not under general anaesthetic, the only thing you need to do is to hold still. And as Jesus comes to Peter, Peter does exactly that. He holds still. He says, you know, fair cop. I haven't done well. I let you down. He doesn't try and pretend that there was a reason for it. He doesn't justify himself. He doesn't become angry. He just allows Jesus to probe what he's done wrong and allows him to forgive it. And actually, true repentance brings freedom. You know, when the operation is over, there's healing. That's what Jesus does. He wants to heal our sin. He wants to take it away from us. And that's what grace is all about. But we can't receive grace without first acknowledging our failures, our sin. And that's what Peter does in this moment. And as he does, he is healed. So don't sweep your regrets or your flaws or your sin under the carpet. You know, Robbie Williams once sang, "No regrets, they don't work." It's true, regrets are not great, but we can't just pretend they're not there. We can't just sort of sweep them on the carpet and say, no, I'm just going to carry on. No, we have to acknowledge them and then allow Jesus to bring his healing and his forgiveness. You know, the truth, Jesus said, will set you free. The truth is this, that you are more flawed, more sinful than you realize. And yet you are more loved than you will ever comprehend. And that's what Jesus brings, his love. The third thing Jesus promises us about coming out of lockdown is that he has plans for the future, for your future. You know, 3 times he says to Peter, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. The word is poimenos. This is the word of a shepherd. And then Jesus obviously described himself as the good shepherd. But here he's saying to Peter, you are the shepherd. And isn't this wonderful? Isn't this the gospel at work? You are such a failure, Peter. Now go and lead my people. You know, Peter, you really made a mistake. You really screwed up. Now take charge of my sheep. You know, that's what Jesus says to us. You may have made mistakes in the past, but Jesus' forgiveness means that you can be weak and then be strong. You know, religion says, I'm going to be strong. I'm going to have it all together. And then maybe God will love me. The gospel says, I am weak. You are weak. And in your weakness, God will make you strong. So what does it mean for you to feed Jesus' sheep? One of the exciting things I've seen is people getting stuck into the food bank, literally giving food to feed those who are in need. On a call this week with the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, the needs are only going to grow in Bristol. And isn't it amazing to be able to help looking after others? Maybe there are people in your life, I don't know if you've had this experience. There are a lot of people that I've lost touch with during lockdown, but actually there are a lot of people who've come into my life, my neighbours, people I see every day. Could it be that God is calling you to persevere with some of those new relationships that you've developed over lockdown? Maybe looking after people in the church. Wouldn't it be amazing if each of us maybe took 2 people that we've come into contact with through church or through Alpha Online and just dropped them a text and said, how are you doing? Haven't seen you for a while. Are you okay? Maybe it looks like inviting someone to Alpha. We've got a new Alpha starting soon. Whatever it is, what is God calling you to do to feed the people of God? And I think for us as a church, it's a really interesting time coming out of lockdown. You know, did you know there was no church buildings for the first 300 years? And I think it's interesting to see what's happened during this lockdown time. You know, for me, it looks like the church is turning inside out. We've been forced out of the building, into our communities, into our neighbourhoods. And we're meeting. I mean, what's amazing is the number of people who are meeting through Church Online has doubled since we went online. The number of people in V groups has increased. This last term, 157 people have been on Alpha. It's been exciting to see that. But at the same time, the church building has been used to feed the hungry. It's like the church has been turned inside out. And I don't think God's calling us to go back. I think he's calling us to go forward, to feed his people in whatever way we can. So you don't need to fear the future for the end of lockdown. Why? Because Jesus is there. He's with you. He's gone ahead of you. The Holy Spirit is there. And God's not going, I had great plans for you, but lockdown came. It's all gone wrong. I don't know what to do now. He's not saying that at all. He's got great plans. In fact, lockdown might have been part of his plan for you to develop in you the likeness of Jesus. Last week, I interviewed Church Online Nathan. Nathan, who hadn't been to church for 10 years. And he was also out of work because of illness. And this is what he wrote about his experience. He said, doing Alpha has completely transformed me. I felt God drawing me closer to him to remind me of why I became a Christian in the first place, but also guiding me as I think about my future and my purpose. My passion for church is back, and I'm learning to trust him more and more in my life. He's actually gone back to work in the last couple of weeks. But that is the difference that Jesus makes. He has a plan for you. You don't have to worry about the future. Coming out of lockdown is not going to be easy. I'm not promising that. And Jesus is not promising that either. He says to Peter, you know what? Life is going to be difficult. Following Jesus is tough. You may end up, Peter ended up going to his death for his love for Jesus. But why did he do that? Because he had met the Good Shepherd who loved him, who laid down his life for him, who led him forward. And Jesus says to him, follow me. My advice to you, if you want to know how to come out of lockdown well, follow Jesus. Don't look at other people's path. Don't compare yourself with others. In fact, Peter says, well, what about John? What about him? Jesus says, no, don't worry about him. Follow me. Jesus is the Good Shepherd. He laid down his life for you. He's got a great plan for you, and he'll be with you. So follow Jesus, follow his example, feed his sheep, and let's see what God might do. Amen.